Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the DC Rap interview series. I'm Pat Pobletti from WisPolitics.com, and joining me this week is U.S. Rep. Gwen Moore from Wisconsin's 4th Congressional District. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining me.
Really, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, over the course of the last week or so, we've seen protests spring up both statewide and across the country to the death of George Floyd while in police custody. Now, to start, rather than asking you a question, I kind of want to just open up the floor to you to share your thoughts and feelings on both the incident in Minnesota, the protests in your home city of Milwaukee, across the state, and across the country, really.
Well, I tell you, as someone who's 69 years old, I have to say, tragically and sadly, this is not the first time I have seen this happen. And it's always the same issue. I remember literally 40 years ago, going to a rally for Ernest Lacey right here in Milwaukee, who died from the same sort of barbaric tactics, the neck compressions, which cause what they call a vagal reaction. I had no idea that police forces across the country were still using this barbaric form of restraint, because it had been determined as long back as 40 years ago that was an inappropriate way to subdue someone. And so, unfortunately, it's a different day, same old stuff. And I think that is, the reason that you see such an explosion in the midst of a pandemic where people are putting their lives at risk to protest. I think that it is a reaction to just the unthinkable, that it could continue to happen over and over and over again. I'll tell you, when I first saw the photo of Mr. Floyd lying there with the officer's knee on his neck, I had a visceral reaction. I could feel a lightning bolt of pain shoot all the way through my body, just as a reaction to seeing the photo.
Now, as you mentioned, stories about police killing Black people are tragically not new, nor are protests in the wake of these deaths. I mean, just offhand, I can think of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling. But at least from my perspective as a journalist covering this, it's the nationwide nature of the response. It feels a little bit different this time around. Do you feel the same way? And do you feel that's encouraging at all?
Well, I can tell you, we have had nationwide uprisings before, only to be met with one reaction, and that is to just subdue the protesters and to placate them. I think what feels different this time is that you have people like Val Demings, who's being considered as a VP selection, someone who wore the uniform saying, brothers and sisters in blue, what the hell are you doing? I think that's the difference. I think that that leaders who, instead of just trying to stop people from protesting, are saying, let's do something to sort of stem the tide. Let's do something to end at least these elements of structural racism. And I have a proposal, and the Congressional Black Caucus is right now putting a package together that will deal with some of the most onerous features of our policing structure. Number one, the sort of militia type policing that's done within our communities, to sort of end weaponizing local forces with these militia type, this type equipment. I have a bill that would require police de-escalation training. Right now, police officers are given 58 hours of training on how to shoot, another 49 hours on how to defend themselves, and eight hours on voluntary training in de-escalation. This is shown to work, and it has worked even in the past few days to have some skills around de-escalation, so you're not always using unnecessary force. And there are very many other efforts. I mean, like making this maneuver, the neck constraints, illegal for police departments to be able to use uh, uh, as a regular course of police procedures. All of these things, we need to do this legislatively and not just quiet the protesters.
Is You mentioned legislative solutions, but is it legislation at the federal level that brings about real meaningful change? And I ask that because we saw President Obama earlier this week publish a really poignant piece on Medium, kind of stressing the engagement of, or the importance of engagement at the local level, kind of where decisions on ground level criminal justice and police practices are really formed. So is it at that federal level? Is it the local level? Is it everywhere in between?
It's everywhere. This is everybody's problem. And that was one of the things. I mean, before I really respond directly to your question, I just want to mention how refreshing it was to see this being a multiracial, intergenerational sort of protest environment. This is everybody's problem. And it's not just the federal government, although the federal government does need to be involved. I mean, we need, the sort of the patterns and practices investigations that the Justice Department were doing under President Obama were no longer being done under Trump. And I think that has given police agencies license to do what they will. But I do agree with President Obama that it's every level of government, down to who the brand new mayor of Ferguson, Missouri hires or works with as a police chief, to who the police chief is, the local ordinances that aldermen put in place. All of it matters. This is because the racist activity happens all the way down the food chain. I want to mention that Bull Connor, for example, these were local elected officials. And so, yeah, it does matter.
And so lastly, we spoke mainly about the death of George Floyd and the protests that have sprung up afterwards. I wanted to give you a chance to anything you have on your mind, anything you're working on in particular, if you have any more on either the protests or police brutality in general. The floor is yours. Take it away.
We have heard, we hear Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and now George Floyd. But I don't want us to forget that this is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so we have those same problems. I mean, right here on our own ground here, we had Sylville Smith killed, shot a police officer. We had Dontre Hamilton, crime, sleeping on a Milwaukee County park bench. How did he end up with 14 bullets in him? I mean, this is an unsustainable a way to have a democracy, to be afraid every day for your sons and daughters' lives. As a Black mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, I am so concerned about their safety in the streets. I mean, to be a Black mother and to worry about whether or not your son is going to be stereotyped by the police if he wears a black mask. I found myself chasing around for every white mask and every beige mask and light blue mask that I can find, so that my sons and my daughter will not look suspicious. I mean, when you have to cleave to those sort of paranoid fantasies, something is really wrong. And I don't want to think, and I also just want to say that a lot of burden is placed on our police department for structural racism. It's not just policing that's racist. I mean, it's housing opportunities, job opportunities, educational opportunities. And when you scale these things up, it's a volcano ready to explode. So often the police catch the tail end of a community's frustration. So we need to work on dismantling structural racism at its root and core.
Congresswoman Gwen Moore, thank you so much for taking the time to join me this week and for your poignant thoughts on what we've seen, the protests we've seen spring up across Wisconsin.
And you be well and be safe.
Thank you very much. That was Congresswoman Gwen Moore. For more from the DC Rap interview series, more from Wisconsin's federal lawmakers, and content from Washington, D.C., check out wispolitics.com DC Rap. We'll see you guys all next week.